Welcome back to the Brian Oak podcast. Once again, I'm joined by Joe Chislett from KRITIKOS. And today we're really going to be diving into some different applications of the content we've discussed already. And we're going to be folding in the world of AI. That's what I sell is AI management systems, AI auditing, and these types of things. And there's a lot of overlap when it comes to human thinking, decision making, judgments, all the things that we've been talking about, and how that applies into now this automated machine world where they're making decisions and judgments, and those are being automated by machines. So I'm really excited to get into the weeds of some of this stuff because I think everybody's trying to sort out AI, and there's a lot of challenges that go with that, and most of them come with decision-making frameworks within businesses. And we'll dive in on that here in a little bit. But Joe, how are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm pretty good, thanks, Brian. I've taken one step towards the American look. So I've now
Yeah.
gone for I've lost the jumper and it's now the unbuttoned shirt over the t-shirt. So I'll be in a hoodie by the end of the series, don't worry.
That's great. That's great. Well, I'm keeping the trend alive over here with the hoodies on, but I'm glad that we're loosening up. We're loosening up. So well, I want to just quick recap everything, but Joe, I'd like you to give the explanation of where we started and where we are now so that everyone is on the same page if they haven't heard the previous three episodes from you.
Yeah, sure. So I think we began where I often begin, which is looking at this sort of common distinction between fact and opinion. And I sort of critiqued that a little bit and suggested that maybe in doing that, we're missing out on a really important area of stuff which kind of lies between them, which is what I call judgments. And judgments are things that have elements of each. You know, they are like like opinions. They vary from person to person, and they might be they might be different valid takes out there. But more like facts, and unlike opinions, they can sometimes be right or wrong or be better or worse. And so they have an element of risk attached to them, and there's an uncertainty about them, which there isn't about facts or opinions. But I actually think that they characterize a lot of what we're talking about when we're thinking critically more accurately. So we looked at this idea of judgment, and I sort of suggested why it's good to sort of try and see things a little bit more as a matter of judgment. I'm not saying there aren't such things as facts or opinions, but if you can try and move more things out of the kind of sort of like simple fact box into the box where maybe there's an element of judgment or interpretation going on, that's probably a good thing. And there are a lot of other good consequences for your thinking, I think, which we looked at in earlier episodes. But then we moved on to the question of like what happens when you try and share your judgments with other people and sharing your thinking really with other people, because we can say that thinking and judgments are almost the same thing. You know, judgments are like the output of our thinking. Um, and there are, because this is an area that often gets forgotten, I think, in critical thinking. It's often treated as if it's this like just independent mind thinking about the world. But actually, our thinking, as we'll be talking about again today, takes place in a social context. And we need to share your thinking. And however good your thinking is, if you can't share it effectively with other people, it hasn't got much value, basically.
Right.
But there are problems with that, and and we looked at that last time. So the issue of how you share your thinking and sort of some of the challenges involved in doing that, how to do it well or not so well, and so that's sort of where we're at really. So we were sharing thinking with people last time, right? So that's
Right. And now we've come all the way to now we have to share our thinking with machines, and we also have to interact with machines. And AI is this revolutionary technology that it's been around for a lot longer than people think, actually. But now it's got the processing power to make decisions and judgments and automate those things, and evaluate huge parameter sets and draw on information and context that is you know un well, humans don't have that processing power. So it's very interesting, and there's a lot of concerns about AI, but there is also just this amazing capability that comes with the technology that if you're able to really master the skills of decision making and weighing your judgments and then communicating them effectively, you're able to take that next step into leveraging the technology. That's one of the key skills that I think really this type of decision making framework allows someone to step into. So we're going to dive a little bit into some AI concepts, but Joe, I know you wanted to get into a couple of things before we got there with respect to sharing your thinking and just building off of last week. Set that conversation up.
Yeah. So, sort of the first point to make is that a slight reiteration of last week is that our thinking evolved in a social context, and it's evolved to kind of assume that we're dealing with a human agent, the other end of it. And so we have these kind of like inbuilt mechanisms, which are partly, it's very interesting, they seem to be partly instinctual, but it doesn't really matter whether they're things that we've learned through upbringing or instinctively. Nevertheless, we have them, and they are things like assessing what people say. We have these mechanisms. They're things like their intent, their expertise, their reputation, their confidence. All these things are a package that we use, that we're constantly dipping. We're constantly monitoring all the time in a conversation. We're constantly making little sort of instinctive assessments of these things and modifying as we go our level of trust in the other person. And few, if any, of these apply to the output of an AI. So that puts us in a slightly unusual, awkward situation because our inbuilt mechanisms for assessing reliability and credibility and accuracy and truthfulness and all these kind of things don't really work. And so, because that's the case, and because, as you say, they have access just to this unbelievable amount of information and their processing power, and the fact that they are incredibly accurate in lots of ways, combined with the fact that, perhaps we're a little bit lazy, and perhaps there's a sensible argument for, why do something yourself if you can get someone else or something else to do it for you? There's an efficiency argument and everything, productivity, etc. That for all these things point to this massive temptation to just not do the thinking, let it do the thinking, or not critique its thinking. And so hence this kind of worry or fear that we're going to just like outsource that completely. Now, I don't know if you want to come back on that at this point, because or
I,
uh,
you mentioned intent, expertise, and confidence, but AIs are always very confident in their
mhm.
outputs,
Yeah, we're going to talk about that. Okay.
even if they're totally wrong. You can. Everyone's got their examples, but one that I like is if you ask ChatGPT what happened this day in history, it will absolutely make things up, dates and those types of things. It pulls in, it's inaccurate,
Mm,
and if you say that's wrong, it'll be like, oh yeah, great catch. You know,
mm,
so it's always going to have that confidence, which to your point, you can't rely on confidence to equal trust. Expertise, it absolutely has access to way more information than you would, but again, it might just be making things up. Hallucinating is what that's generally referred as. And then intent, so the intent is actually set by whoever created the model, or
mm,
who's like deciding the governance of it is kind of the term in the compliance risk world and safety world with AI. Is all that liability does roll back to the brand or the company that set the model to work this way. And that's how actually I work with companies to help mitigate bias in that, or help prevent or eliminate risks and unfair treatment of outcomes. But at the end of the day, it is difficult to just accept the output of an AI unless you know all of the other stuff. So instead
mm,
of like having those intuitive conversations and those verbal and nonverbal cues and things that we use in the social context, now you just have words on a screen, and you have to trust that the output of those words is actually pulling the right data, actually, has the right intent, is being checked to make sure that the outcomes aren't skewed one way or another in terms of a decision that's being automated. And there's lots of examples we can dive into there, but just to
mm,
build on that's the risk that's like
mm,
labeled and called out specifically. And there's all sorts of like they they layer on each other with that, but the outcome, it's one way or another. And generally it always just boils back to the person behind with the decision making authority to approve that that model's working correctly. So you have to be able to trust the person still, but that person is probably a an executive in a company who you never will
Well,
ever speak to, and we don't always know what their intent is. And if it's a publicly traded company, they have fiduciary responsibility to shareholders. So is it
okay.
actually there to help you? Is it there to help their pocketbook? Is the outcome beneficial to whom? In, how are they using it? Those are things that
Right.
are really challenging for end customers or users or anything like that. So that's a little bit of a run on, but there's so much that is different yet the same. It's just repackaged
Yeah,
with it.
mind you, some of those things you've triggered a few. I mean, I was frightened enough of AI already until you added those extra layers of paranoia. To think of these shady
I
people in the suits somewhere behind the scenes pulling the pulling the strings.
Yeah, no, I
Um,
told you there's concerning things that I try not to get my head super deep in.
yeah, I
But
mean, the worry sometimes is whether whether the light's on inside this black box, but it sounds like there is a light on somewhere, but it's not necessarily inside the black box, and it's not always
yeah,
a very nice light. Um, I I think it's worth pointing out that some of those, the mechanisms I talked about, um, you know, they they're not always entirely reliable, even amongst people
right.
as signals. Things like intent. You never truly know someone else's intent. You need to sort of be a mind reader to some extent. But there are sort of signals that kind of give that off, and a lot of conversations about trying to establish the intent. Likewise, confidence. Confidence is something that it can be used. It can be hacked. People can use it because it's a signal, but it's not always reliable. In some contexts, it is a reliable signal. If you ask a total stranger, in a new town you've arrived in, which way to the train station, and if they say, "Oh yeah, sure, mate. Okay, you take the second on the left," blah 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 blah, blah, you're going to trust them. But if they kind of go, oh, I don't know, I think it could be the first on the. No, hang on a sec. No, I think what you do is you go to the roundabout. No, no, that's wrong. No, you don't do that. You know,
Yeah.
you'd be wise to treat that person with less confidence than the first person. So confidence is a sign when you don't have access to everything, all the information, everything going on inside someone's head and their expertise and all that kind of stuff, it's a signal. But it's because people know that we can then put on confidence and use confidence to kind of manipulate people.
Hmm.
And it's an evolved mechanism that we have as one of many signals that kind of we read all the time. But because it is there and it's something in us, when we come up against this content that comes out of these LLMs and it's just unbelievably confident, unbelievably fluent. Fluency is another one that we use. It's another kind of proxy that we use as a way of sort of like, sort of intuiting credibility and authority and reliability. So you've got this kind of confident, fluent output that is hard for us to critique. That just feeds back onto the point I made earlier. I think that what I'd quite like to look at just quickly is there's a couple of solutions that people. I mean, I have to confess, I'm not a huge user of AI, other than that when you have no choice, Google search something and I get the AI responses, and they're often like they can be funny, but they can also be very useful depending on the context. Um, but the sort of solutions, if I ever express or hear concerns about things like the outsourcing and the brain rot, to use the kind of colloquial expression that's going on, people sometimes say the first thing people say is, "Well, of course, I don't. That would be awful if I just trusted it, but I don't use it that way. I actually use AI as more like a sparring partner." I've heard this phrase used quite a lot, and I think that's an interesting one, and actually it could be quite a good one in some ways, because if referring to last week we talked about sort of the problems involved in sharing thinking with people because of all the ego stuff that's at stake, the need people have to be validated, the fact that they feel a threat when their opinions are challenged. Now, Matt, in fact, this is a nice little analogy I thought of just today. Is no matter how much great pains you go to not to attack them, but to attack their arguments. However careful you are not to attack the person, it's still going to often feel like an attack on them
Hmm.
because your arguments are your thoughts and they're an expression of what you think is a logical way of looking at the world. So if someone's attacking your argument, even if they're not attacking you, they're sort of attacking what you think is sensible. It's a bit like saying to someone, "Oh, I'm not attacking you. I'm just attacking your clothes." thinking, well, that's quite interesting because, yeah, that's true. But my clothes are an expression of me and my choices. And our arguments are expression of us and our choices. So you can attack someone's argument without attacking the person, but it still often will feel like uncomfortable, like you are being attacked. I guess I'm just that's picking up on stuff last week. I just thought it was quite a nice analogy that
Yeah.
however careful you are not to sort of attack the person, even when you're attacking their thoughts and arguments, it can feel personal. And of course, the advantage of of using AI as a sparring partner is that it doesn't have that baggage. You're not going to insult hurt its feelings and that kind of thing. And so, in some ways, you can punch it as hard as you like, and also perhaps you can be more open and honest about your own thoughts because you're not worried about saying something that might appear stupid or wrong or unethical or whatever. You can be a bit more open about how you go about. So I can see those sort of advantages. Um, but the disadvantage, it seems to me, and I haven't used it very much, but I get the impression that it's it doesn't you don't get a lot of pushback from it because it's not the same as a person that wants to win an argument like we talked about last. So the advantage is also a disadvantage in that you're not dealing with a person that actually cares and you're not fighting against a real person. And I actually get the feeling that not only do they not push back enough, but they seem to kind of validate too much. There's something about in the way they're built, and that might be something that you can change and you can play around with how you prompt it. But they seem to be, like you said, they just seem to be almost comically. They'll just kind of validate you so much, to the extent that it just seems like it's a bit like I said last time. Validation is good, but not if it seems inauthentic. And it's like I was trying to sort of redesign my website recently, and you put in the kind of you try it says like, what's your company name? And it says, and you give what does it do? And it's always like, great answer, great name, great idea, great.
Yeah.
And you're thinking, yeah, really? I just
It's
imagine like, just imagine
yeah.
you've got something like, what is your company all about? It could be something awful. You could write in something like, oh, it's like I'm going to set up like a paedophile ring in like a pizza parlor. And they say, oh, great idea, great name, great mission. And you're like, okay, so you're going to say,
That's like way too poignant
I'm
of a
sorry, I
topic
probably
these
can't.
days. I don't know. It's just more United States drama
No,
going on
I know.
over here.
It
It's
was
terrible.
deliberate. I
But
thought,
no,
it's like,
you are right
that's,
though. So I was going to bring this up. So on this topic, kind of build. So there. So there's a lawsuit that was settled. There's a company called Character AI, and what the what the chatbot did, the interaction ultimately led like a teenager to commit suicide because
mm,
it told them, yes, that's a great idea, and it like encouraged them.
right.
And these are unchecked, you know, applications and solutions, and the technology is so powerful,
Mm,
and so many people are racing into spaces for companionship, mental health, things that are like vulnerable communities that are susceptible to, that kind of, yeah, validation. Yeah, tell me more. But they may not have the mental capacity. Obviously, teenagers are their brains are just forming and they're going through lots of changes and things like that. So all the things you just said about it validating you, it is those are negative outcomes. And then I think also, yeah, there's a lot of people who use it as a sparring partner to challenge thoughts, and that can be beneficial. One way that I like to use it is say, I need you to assume this type of role, and these are the outputs that I'm looking for. So I treat it as like in business, hey, I need to bounce some ideas off of you as a marketing expert specific to this industry. This is the audience that I'm speaking to, and this is my idea. Can you help me work through some of the language that would be more appropriate for this audience? So
mm,
that helps me really be more of a
mm,
wordsmith, but that's really tight versus, hey, I have an
mm,
idea, tell me if it's good or bad. Because it generally will
Yeah.
tell you it's a wonderful good idea no matter what's going on, because it has kind of that, what is the word? Sycophant. I
Yeah.
hear people say LLMs are sycophants, but
Mm,
anyways, it's just all how those things are developed, and you can kind of prompt your way out of those. But again, you have to think about it, like treat it
mm,
as a person, and like, I
yeah.
need you to play this role. I need you to weigh things out this way, and you need to be able to interpret the feedback that you're
Mm,
getting from an LLM. So when I think about the skills that we've had, the judgments and the shared thinking, and now the interaction with an LLM agent or something along those lines, you have to be able to weigh the responses you're getting. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges that people have, is taking that output and saying, oh, well, the LLM told me it was right. And they said it was a great idea. So now I'm going to invest lots of money into this, or I'm going to wholesale change my career, or whatever the output is, good or bad. You have to understand what's real, what's not real,
mm,
because it can just confidently say the wrong thing,
yeah.
validate you. And if you don't possess the capability to pause, think, weigh, evaluate, and ultimately make those decisions, then, you have
Yeah, you're
potential
absolutely
failing.
right, right, and just to make the problem worse, unfortunately, I just wanted to look at a sort of, a solution that you're often given. People kind of trot out as if, don't, they say, look, don't worry about me because always remember to verify. I make sure that I verify everything. Or perhaps you might say that's the advice. That's that people say, use it, but make sure you verify it.
Yeah, trust and
And
verify.
yeah, and unfortunately, I find this is not a very satisfactory answer because, like, this goes back to the judgment thing. I mean, you can only verify things which are purely factual. You can't verify something if it's an opinion. You can't verify as soon as something has an element of judgment or interpretation built into it, then it's no longer something you can verify. And one of the things, like, I'm sort of my principles from the first episode, trying to see things more as a matter of judgment than as facts and opinions, is that a lot of things that might seem like facts, once you kind of critically analyze them a little bit, do contain elements of judgment. And as soon as you've realized that, then it's no longer something that you can verify simply. Um, so the slice of things that you could potentially verify is actually smaller, perhaps, than you you might think. I think it's actually very small, but that's a matter of judgment in itself. But even if you just take that subset of claims that are facts, you've still got your work cut out for you because verifying, fact checking is hard work. It takes time.
Mhm.
It's a full time job out, and it's increasingly difficult in a sort of information landscape which is saturated with stuff that itself needs needs verification. You're verifying something against something else which itself needs kind of verifying, so you'd spend your whole life verifying it, and the whole point of it is to speed things up, so you've lost the value in the first place. Okay. And so what you actually have, I remember hearing an interview with, he was the editor of the Wired magazine, Kevin Kelly, I think he was called. It was a few years ago, and he sort of made a prediction or a judgment, if you like. It was his judgment, and he sort of said that, looking at the world, w- he felt that we're almost going to have to give up on this idea of truth and truthfulness and live in a world of likelihood. And what all
Yep.
you're ever really going to have, because if everything can be sort of simulated and the simulations can be so convincing, you can never really know exactly 100% what is or isn't true or real. The best you can ever get is some kind of corroboration with some other source or something like. So when people say verify, I don't know if what they really mean. They probably mean look into it a bit and see if you get the same answer somewhere else. And if that's okay, sure, you can do that, but that's hardly the solution to the problem. You know, I just
Right.
checked it somewhere else and I got the same answer. So this verifying things, it just, when you analyze it, I'm afraid it just doesn't. There might be 5% of AI content that you could, like, I don't know. I'm just picking that figure out of the air, but
No, yeah. Let
um,
me let
I
me
mean,
jump in on this,
yeah,
because
sure,
this is the work that happens at Babel. So we measure AI outputs so that there's confidence and trust on the outcome. So this concept of AI auditing is it's unique in that you're right. The outputs are probabilistic. These are statistical biases that can appear within outputs. So how often is the output something that we would determine as is right? So when we go back to someone at the beginning has to define what the output should be, right? And this is kind of the desired outcome of how outputs are generated and what is acceptable. Then you can actually measure how often you're getting the right output. So the black box is a great term to describe just generally the series of information exchange and how it all packages all the information up. You're looking at what's the initial input and the context of the input, and then what decision and action is made off of that, and how consistently are you getting a decision and action that is acceptable. So I'm going to go back to, you have to be able to make a judgment with some risks where it might be wrong, it might be right. Businesses are trying to define that. They have to put it on like policy and document, like this is right. This is what we want our AIs to be doing. And then you can go and measure statistically how often that's happening. So that's how like the future with AI is going to be ultimately decided. If the AI is trustworthy, hey, 95% of the time we're getting an accurate response. So we go in and we test X amount of times to make sure that we're still within that kind of hit rate. And it's all about precision of the output. So some of
Mm.
them are going to be wild, like an LLM is just going to throw words. And I think that responsibility comes back on the user to say, okay, that is the output I'm looking for.
This is obviously something you know quite a lot about, and it feels like almost I should. I feel like asking the questions more than giving the answers here. I mean, what I'm interested in is to what extent these kind of like critical thinking, like techniques and concepts and things. There's the idea that you can just apply critical thinking to AI. Uh, is well, of course we need to, but it's not completely straightforward because a lot of these techniques are built up on sort of mechanisms that have evolved to deal with human agents, like
Hmm.
I've been saying. If you're recognizing that, if you do recognize things are a matter of judgment, like there's some uncertainty built into them, then that's healthy because even if it means you can't verify them, at least it means you're not going to just swallow it completely, hook, line, and sinker straight away. So that's like another advantage of seeing things in terms of judgments is that it kind of puts this kind of critical distance between you and the claim being made. You kind of go, okay, that's you think I can see something questionable about that. Maybe it's been phrased with a bit too much certainty, maybe a bit too much confidence. Maybe, but there's something questionable about that. It might be true, but I'm not just going to accept it, even though it's been expressed very confidently and fluently. So critical thinking will help you just buy that critical distance at least. But it's a long question, this. But do you think that people need, as much as critical thinking is an understanding of how the kind of machines are working and the processes by which they are like producing the content? And is it feasible and realistic that the population can be taught all this stuff? I mean, what's it going to be taught in? there's always an answer, like with
There's
every problem. It seems I laugh about this because my background's in education. My wife is an assistant head of a like secondary school in the UK, kind of like a high school, I guess, like 11 to
Mhm.
18-year-olds. Um, and like she's always it infuriates her that every time there's a social problem, it's always like, well, the kids should be taught this in schools. Everything, if you teach them it in schools, teach them it in schools. It's like schools is always the answer. Rather maybe like the home or somewhere they could, maybe that's something that they should be taught. But the idea that you just tell them something and then they'll know it for the rest of their lives. That it's not like teachers aren't trying to teach things; they're trying as hard as they can to teach things already. So just throwing them more things, should teachers then have to teach kids, how AI works? Should we all need to have a working understanding? Because I imagine it's quite complicated what goes on inside these reasoning models and algorithms and things. It's not going to be simple.
it's
So
math.
what?
It's all
Yeah.
math. It's all
So
math driven. And that's what's interesting about AI to me is, well, lots of things, but everything is truly math. Like all of this is some
Mm,
mathematical output. It's an algorithm.
mm,
It's just that words are now math. They're predictable. Ideas are now predictable based on a combination of words. And LLMs are crazy, but all it's doing is predicting and guessing the next right word. And if you go look at it, I can't even remember what it is in terms of like the actual phrasing of it. So I'm not going to say it, but like you can Google the mathematical concepts behind an LLM. And it's wild, but it's all statistics. And I'm just going to go out and say that no, Joe, you can't expect everybody to understand how AI works at like the most fundamental elemental levels. There should be broad literacy on it. Like we should generally understand what's going on. So I just mentioned this context, input, decision, and action framework, which is the simplest way that I've learned how to kind of understand how algorithms work. So I'll just take 2 seconds to explain it. This all comes from like the Babel education. So the company I'm working for. But your context is what's kind of the world of information that is going into the potential input. So if you think about a business, it's always easier to package this up for business. But if I'm a business, I care about a finite amount of things that impact my business, and I don't care about a much larger amount of things. Now, I'm just going to focus on the context of my business. I want to make sure that my customer is treated well when they use my AI. So, trying to sell things. So, when I'm using AI, there's certain inputs that go in. Think sales discovery. You have a customer filling out a form online. It's going to take all that information in, but you filtered out a tremendous amount of the context already. So,
mm,
that context isn't available to the algorithm in the simple model, just what the input is. So you've already removed a lot of the information that the machine may or may not have. It just gets the inputs. Now, the inputs could be human typed in, it could be a database that lives offline, it could be historical decisions that the company has made. So, where the data that it's pulling from those inputs, those could be all over the place. And everything has these API hook ins and all this. So, like, your inputs are really kind of this like interesting space if you're a user, like what else is going into the now decision that comes from your input that you put in, the trigger. Now the decision's made by the model, and then some action happens after that. So uh, this is the simplest way to break down an algorithm, but all of that is just it's if you can get your head around that concept and
mm,
understand that every time you put something into a an AI solution, that it's taking your input as a trigger, it's grabbing information from other places, making a decision or a judgment, and then acting on that. And that action could just be delivering it to another human to do something with it, or it could be handing it off to an agent. It could be processing an order. It could be whatever you want it to be. That's how AI generally can be thought of. There's so many other like layers to the taxonomy of algorithms that I'll leave to the PhDs to explain and the mathematicians, but that's probably a little more mechanical than we need to go into. But uh, I don't think that people need to know all the depth of knowledge that comes into how AI works, other than like the basics.
mm,
So I think if you can get a working model mentally
mm,
and you understand kind of the basics of it, you're going to be a little more aware of what you're putting into certain.
mm. Okay, so yeah, that was really interesting. It's kind of it's prompted three questions to me. Um, the first is like, does AI actually? Are we right to say that AI makes judgments
I,
itself?
I
Um,
think it's automating them. Yes,
right.
100%.
Okay. Well, I agree. I think some people might find that strange. I've encountered pushback when when I've put this idea out there. This was maybe a year or two ago, so maybe that's changed because this assumption that a judgment requires a conscious mind. But I'm not thinking of a judgment like that. I'm thinking of it in terms of deriving some new information from that information that's based on that information. This sounds a bit
Yeah, no,
technical,
I
but
have a really good example on this.
but
Let me
if you, that in a sense, it could be completely, the whole process could be completely unconscious. But
right.
it, what you've got is something that is derived from other stuff and is not a matter of fact anymore because it's been inferred on the basis of other stuff, but it's not just a matter of opinion because it has been inferred on the basis of other stuff. So it's hovering between something that is a fact and an opinion in the way that I define a judgment. So technically, it is a judgment. It doesn't matter whether it's been arrived at through a process of judging or whether it's been arrived at through rolling a dice. It doesn't really matter. You ended up with something. It's a bit like the thing about the infinite number of monkeys on typewriters. Eventually, they'll sort of write the complete works of Shakespeare. It
Right.
doesn't matter whether they've any of that's you still the output is the output of the is a judgment. It doesn't matter how it's been reached. The point is, it's a claim it's going beyond the facts, but it is based on something and could be true or false. Sorry, that was a very
So
long-winded answer, but
no, no,
yes, I
you're good.
agree.
So
I agree with
here's
you.
like here's a practical example of it's making judgments. So we do a lot of work with auditing automated employment decision tools. So you put your resume in for a job. AI is now making the choice whether you are or aren't worthy of an interview. So all of that is reading your resume,
Mhm.
and what's happened is they've injected AI into this, and it's doing the first pass. So think of all the potential ways it could pick up something that it doesn't like you as a candidate based on a resume. And it's making the choice before a human gets a chance to review it. So it's making kind of the pre-screen, but it's making the choice for the company. And there are laws that, protect
Mhm.
certain protected classes. So there's actually a massive class action lawsuit going on right now against Workday because they used an automated employment decision tool that basically ruled out anybody over the age of 40. The class action lawsuit, I think there's some elements of racial or handicap in the claim, the plaintiff, that are also in, scope of the lawsuit. But it's gone for a while now. It's gone into a couple rounds of discovery. It hasn't been settled, but it's a huge lawsuit, and it's because it was making automated decisions on who was or was not qualified for a job. And it's automating the choice of the company using that tool. And the company, like their role in this is they have to define what is right for that tool to say yes or
Mm.
no to.
Mm.
So while the decision is being made by the AI tool in the pre-screen, what should be happening within an organization is they should be defining what is right for the
Mm.
choices. So
Mm.
that's where you get upstream back into the users are making the choices. Now, the
Right.
challenge is the company employing Workday, they could have made all the right decisions. It's just that this is honestly like how I've described this. The company could have said, "I want the cheapest and best talent," right? And that could be the goal of the AI. Now, the AI, because its goal is cheap, great talent, it's going to target younger people. They're more affordable, right? They don't demand as high a salary. They have skills. They just recently graduated school or whatever, so they have more up-to-date talent and skills and, all the things. And then it's going to learn over time that people that started their career in, 2020 versus, 2005, they're better targets. And we're just going to automatically rule out because, like humans, AI can get lazy. And it's just like, oh, well, that hit that one checkbox and they're out and it dumps it. So I'm just speculating what happened. I have no clue. But that is a very plausible explanation of what happened.
Mm.
And the challenge there for the organizations is somebody's responsible for making sure that that doesn't happen. And where this really is kind of a fun little lawsuit, if you like if you're observing this, is that some of that responsibility falls on the company who employed Workday in their environment, and they materially changed how it was being used. So they might be at fault. And then Workday itself obviously holds responsibility. Workday is making, I think the last time I read about it is like they're trying to push that responsibility onto their end clients so that they have like less of a lawsuit on their hands. But this is a messy, messy deal. So absolutely AI is making judgments. However, the ultimate responsibility goes into who authorized the use of the tool and authorize what right is for the outcomes of that tool. And
Yeah.
that's where I think a lot of companies are really like, they don't, they can't weigh that decision well. So you had
Mm.
another question, a
Yeah,
couple
well,
of,
and you've kind of started to answer it because, following on the question of whether or not AI makes judgments, I thought, well, assuming that they do, what role then does human judgment have? Um, and in a way, you've kind of answered it. It sounds like sort of like the human judgment is to judge
yeah,
which judgments we want them to be able to make. And so it's like a kind of sort of meta level of judgment. And that's interesting. What makes some judgments appropriate for humans to be making and some judgments appropriate for non-humans to be making? That in
mm,
itself is a judgment. It's quite
yeah.
interesting to think about why we would want to keep the human element, because we know that humans are fallible too. Um, and I guess, just sort of thinking aloud here, partly it's to do with the sort of accountability and what kind of world do we want to live in? Do we
Right.
want to live in a world where we are still sort of moral agents making moral decisions? Um, because it sounds like a lot of the judgments you think that humans should be making are almost like ethical ones, about which ones it's right or wrong to outsource. Not just which ones it's pragmatic to outsource, but which ones it's actually appropriate, morally kind of appropriate, right or wrong. Um, and that's a sort of yeah, maybe that's the answer, is that we still occupy the kind of ethical plane and the ethical dimension.
I think
Um,
so. That there's, there was a whole, all right. So unfortunately, we have to talk a little politics in this, but prior to the Trump administration, there was a lot of ethical AI, as like that was a whole kind of genre of AI safety, ethical AI. They, being the new administration, came in and gutted an executive order and basically said, we're not going to use the word ethical AI anymore. Like, it's a no, we aren't going to say that anymore. And the whole industry of AI governance, risk and compliance, and kind of AI safety had to switch. So now we have kind of this unchecked world in the states of there's no federal like framework versus like the EU. The EU has very strict rules and like sets the bar very high in terms of what is acceptable. You mentioned something earlier about we're using AI to make judgments uh, in the courtroom, right? Is someone guilty or not? Sentencing. That's been used for over a decade. There's a use case that I could get into. But I just say read his book. It's called Ethical Machines by Reed Blackman. He does a great job explaining this topic. So just read the book. But effectively, they're using AI to help judges make decisions on sentencing with the hope of reducing recidivism of another incident, right? So
mhm,
with that, historical data was used, and wouldn't you know that a white person got a lesser sentence who had a more severe initial crime than a black
right.
person, because historically we had all this
Mhm,
racial bias that appeared in
mhm,
sentencing decisions, and it wasn't like immaterial. It was like, I think it was like years difference or something like this. So
mhm,
there's there is this ethical moral, there's always a sense of right, I think. It's just, where is your starting point? So some people really do have a narrow lens, and they're like, it's got to be my way or the highway. Then there's like, I'm going to broadly evaluate this. I'm going to use my decision making skills and reasonability and take in the facts and make a better judgment. But that's one that I think is crazy. We have professional judges, which I would assume would have to be very good at the skills you have and you teach, deferring decisions to an artificial intelligence that isn't like audited and inspected. And trust me when I say this, they don't want people looking under the hood at all. There's no way they
Mm,
want auditors in there checking under the hood of these tools. And like there's other articles and things that I've read where like they just won't let anybody in. And so it is scary, but the role of humans, in my opinion, is we have to set what is morally and ethically right, but
mm,
we have also kind of thrown that in the trash can in the United States. My hope is that, like always, like younger people or people that get what we're talking about, where it comes naturally to them, like they get it, that they learn these skills, learn how to use the technology and build better products. Here's the Brian theory. If you're the one creating the system, you have all of the capabilities in front of you to build the foundation so that the outcomes achieved are generally positive towards the collective, the society, right? So people, planet, hey, still got to make money. It's business, it's capitalism. That's not going away, but it's got to do all those things versus a company who just sets goals to make the most amount of money. Because if the goal is just about making the most amount of money, and to win or something along those lines, like you get into like some sticky spots, I think. And that's where you can get really, really biased outputs. And like we don't care about long-term effects because we need to make money this quarter and we'll do everything possible. And that's just like a real challenge because I think our economic systems are built to just focus on bottom line at all costs. And it doesn't take into consideration people. I think
yeah.
people have to watch out for people's best interests in the
Mm,
future because I don't think the machines care. They just really don't because it's just I've been given a goal, I'm going to go achieve my goal and I'm going to do it as best as possible because I'm a machine and that's what I do. Versus in with people, they have the ability to pause and evaluate and weigh kind of the broader context that isn't inherently stated
yeah.
in the output, right? Like
Well,
how
that's
is this impacting the bigger picture? I don't think AI
yeah.
always has the bigger picture at mind. It's more narrow.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think, I mean, that sort of dovetails nicely with my own sort of my to the joke theory, the critical thinking take on it. I was just thinking about it that in a way, I mean, judgments are usually made against some criteria of some sort. That's what makes them kind of more than just an opinion because they're sort of
Mhm.
based on something. And the more objective those criteria are, and the more measurable those criteria are, the more objective the judgment is. Um, and so I think it's okay for, it sounds like we're agreed that it's okay to outsource judgment formation when their judgments made against very fixed criteria,
Yes.
as long as we are selecting the criteria. It's us to judge which criteria to give. And so that's our role. Um, but I think for any judgments that aren't based against really sort of narrow criteria, that's a problem because that requires either some sort of ethical thought and cares and concerns, the things like you said that they don't have, but also it requires a sort of, I think this is neglected, and maybe this is a topic for like maybe a next week or another conversation, but there, to make a judgment about something when you haven't got these kind of fixed criteria, you've got to sort of use your general knowledge and common sense of the world, and that's what you've got to go on, and that's clearly something that they lack.
Right.
And it's very interesting because although they have access to this incredible wealth of information, none of it's really, I would call, knowledge. You know, none of it is actually sort of making a discerning thought about whether or not it's true. I mean, this is quite a philosophical point. I'd like to talk about this another time, but I think that most people would accept intuitively that they sort of lack common sense, and that's why they can come out with those absurd things like what happened on this day, etc., things like that. So I think that judgments, like we're saying, any judgments that require that can't be done against a fixed objective criteria, that require some sort of like general knowledge or common sense or ethical insight, they've got to be human. And as for the judgments which are done against criteria, we've got to be giving the criteria, and so humans have got to. So that's our role at this stage. Who knows what the
Yeah.
future is going to hold? But that seems to be, at least there's a place for us still, right?
There's absolutely a place, and I have a lot more opinions on kind of how once we get our arms around it and start managing AI systems a little bit better, because that's the other, like, I got to hop on a call in 2 minutes to talk about it. But yeah, like I think once we get our arms around how to manage the outputs we're
Mm,
looking for, and that's a challenge. There's a lot of opportunity to expand business, and there's an abundant amount of problems that we can solve with AI because it amplifies whatever you're doing. So if you have a bunch of good people out there trying to solve problems that help society generally, I see that as a path forward where lots of good people using the technology to produce good outcomes really kind of start solving problems wherever they exist. And I see a lot of great advertisements for this. And I do think that there is good coming. We just have to make sure that the good gets here faster than the not so good. And that's a big part of what you teach is helping people think through these challenges and problems and making the choices and prioritizing what is important or not. And then the one thing that I want to just call out to end this on is not every single idea has to exist. There is a moral, ethical obligation sometimes to withhold certain things
uh,
from existing. So I
uh,
think that that's a nice tie back and call back to a previous episode, but it
mm.
certainly applies. So with that, I'm excited that we got to chat on the AI side and talk through this. And I'm sure we'll have more and more conversations. And there's just an endless amount of content. But appreciate the time, Joe.
Likewise.
Alrighty. Cheers, bud.